The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Richard Ivanic's quiet suburban home, casting a warm glow on the tidy street lined with cars and bicycles. The neighborhood was the epitome of tranquility, where children played without fear and neighbors exchanged smiles as they watered their lawns. But on this day, an unsettling silence hung over the Ivanic house, broken only by the distant hum of a police car pulling into the driveway. Detective Harris stepped out, his eyes scanning the immaculate front yard. "So this is the place?" he muttered, flipping open his notepad. Officer Reynolds, standing by the cruiser, nodded gravely. "Yeah, welfare check. Coworkers say Richard hasn't shown up for days. No calls, no emails. Not like him." Harris adjusted his jacket. "All right, let's see what we've got." The knock on the door echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac. No response. Reynolds tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. A neighbor peeked out from behind their curtains, curiosity evident, but no one came forward. "Let's go around," Harris instructed, gesturing toward the backyard. They navigated past the pristine rose bushes to a back door that was slightly ajar, its lock broken. Harris's instincts sharpened. Something's off. The two officers stepped inside cautiously. The air was thick, stale. A faint, sickly odor wafted through the hallway, growing stronger as they moved deeper into the house. Harris exchanged a look with Reynolds, whose hand instinctively rested on his holster. The living room was untouched. A family portrait hung above the mantel, capturing Richard, his wife Laura, their son Nick, and daughter Jamie. The smiles in the photo seemed hauntingly distant now. A calendar on the wall was frozen in time, January 2019. "Reynolds, check upstairs. I'll take the ground floor," Harris directed. Reynolds ascended the creaking stairs, his heart pounding as he pushed open the first door. The master bedroom was undisturbed, the bed neatly made, but as he moved to the next room, he froze. His radio crackled as he called Harris. "You're going to want to see this!" Harris hurried up, finding Reynolds pale-faced in the doorway of a guest bedroom. Inside, the horror unfolded. Richard and Laura lay lifeless, their bodies in advanced stages of decomposition. The room reeked of death, the air almost unbreathable. Downstairs, Harris moved to the basement, flashlight in hand. The beam swept across an old recliner, a pile of boxes, and then another body. Nick Ivanic. Slumped against the wall, lifeless. The weight of the discovery settled heavily on both men. Harris keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Detective Harris. We've got 3 confirmed DOAs at the Ivanic residence. Scene is secure, but we need the coroner and forensics ASAP." As the house filled with activity, Reynolds asked the question that was already on Harris's mind. "What about Jamie? She's not here. Think she ran?" Harris shook his head. "No signs of struggle downstairs. If she left, she didn't leave in a hurry." His gaze landed on the family photo above the fireplace. "But where would she go?" The silence between them was broken by a technician calling from the living room. "Detective, you'll want to see this." Harris followed the voice to a small desk in the corner. A phone was propped against a charging dock. Its screen lit up with a message notification. The text read, "I'm fine, don't worry about me." The sender? Jamie Ivanic. Harris's brow furrowed as the implication settled in. If Jamie was fine, why hadn't she reached out sooner? Why leave her family like this? And why did her text feel so calculated? Something was very wrong. Detective Harris stood outside the Ivanic house, watching as the coroner wheeled out the first gurney. The once vibrant home now radiated an eerie stillness, its white walls stained with the shadow of tragedy. Inside, forensic technicians combed through every corner, snapping photos and bagging evidence. Harris pulled out his notepad, his pen poised but unmoving. The pieces of this puzzle didn't yet fit. Reynolds approached, his face pale but composed. The neighbors didn't see or hear anything unusual, except one. He glanced at his notes. Mrs. Green from across the street said she heard loud banging a few weeks ago, around 10 p.m., thought it was home repairs. Harris frowned. Banging? Around the same time these 3 likely died? That's too much of a coincidence. He glanced back at the house. And Jamie? Still nothing? Reynolds shook his head. No sightings, no contact apart from that text on her phone. Harris flipped through his notepad, revisiting the family's timeline. Richard and Laura Ivanic were pillars of the community, known for their generosity and active involvement in local events. Nick Ivanic, their son, was described as reserved but hardworking, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. And Jamie, the missing piece of this broken picture, where did she fit in? The team gathered more clues, receipts on the counter, unopened mail, and a faint scuff mark near the front door. But one discovery stopped Harris in his tracks. A small wooden chest, partially hidden beneath the couch, contained photographs and handwritten notes. "These look personal," Reynolds said, handing one to Harris. It was a picture of Jamie holding her daughter, smiling brightly. On the back, in delicate handwriting, it read, "For better days, love, Jamie." Harris studied the photo, his mind racing, a mother's love captured in a fleeting moment. But where was she now, and what kind of mother would abandon her family in their time of need? He felt a twinge of guilt for even entertaining the thought. Hours later, back at the precinct, Harris stared at the evidence board. The timeline was incomplete, the motives unclear. He replayed Mrs. Green's account in his head, the banging noises, the silence that followed. It didn't add up. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke his focus. It was Officer Daniels from Forensics. "Detective, we pulled something from one of the victim's phones, Nick Ivanic's, a text thread with Jamie." Harris's heart skipped a beat. "What does it say?" Daniels hesitated. "It's odd, look." He handed Harris the printed transcript. The texts were dated 2 days before the estimated time of death. "Nick, Jamie, what's going on? You've been acting strange lately." Jamie, "I'm fine, just trust me. Everything will be okay soon." Nick, "You don't sound fine. Is it Shelby? Are you in trouble?" Jamie, "I said I'm fine, Nick. Please drop it." Harris felt a chill crawl up his spine. The words were dismissive, yet beneath them lay a desperation that was hard to ignore. Shelby. That name lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. By evening, Harris and Reynolds sat across from Jamie's closest friend, Carla Mason, in a dimly lit interview room. Carla fidgeted nervously, her eyes darting around the room. "I don't know much," she began hesitantly. "Jamie." She wasn't herself lately. She said she felt trapped, that Shelby was controlling, but she never wanted to talk about it. "Did she ever mention leaving?" Harris asked, leaning forward. Carla hesitated. "Once. She said she couldn't stay, but she was scared of what Shelby might do. I thought she was exaggerating." Harris exchanged a look with Reynolds. Carla's words painted a picture of a woman caught in a web of fear, a stark contrast to the smiling Jamie in the photographs. "Thank you, Carla," Harris said, his tone softer now. "If you remember anything else, anything at all, let us know." As Carla left, Harris stared at the board again, this time focusing on Jamie's face. Her disappearance, the strange texts, the family's horrific fate. All roads seemed to lead back to one name, Shelby Neely. But what had he done, and why? The clock ticked in the quiet precinct as Harris's resolve hardened. He wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. Detective Harris sat at his desk staring at the growing evidence board. Photographs of the Ivanic family were pinned alongside timestamps, texts, and scrawled notes. Yet the picture was incomplete, a puzzle missing its key piece, Jamie Ivanic. The text thread between Jamie and Nick replayed in his mind, a haunting echo that hinted at danger but left too much unsaid. Across the room, Reynolds approached, holding a fresh report. "You're going to want to see this," he said, placing it on Harris's desk. "Bank records just came in. Jamie's debit card was used 2 weeks after the estimated time of death for the others. The location? Ohio." Harris's brow furrowed. Ohio? That was nearly 500 miles from Philadelphia. "What was purchased?" he asked, flipping through the report. "Gas, groceries, nothing extravagant, but it's consistent, like someone living there. Someone trying to stay under the radar." The name Shelby Neely flickered in Harris's mind. Jamie's husband, her last known contact. Could he be in Ohio? And if so, where was Jamie? The next morning, Harris and Reynolds sat in the tech lab, watching as forensic analyst Officer Daniels brought up Jamie's phone records, the screen filled with a web of numbers, messages, and timestamps. Daniels zoomed in on the most recent activity, calls made to a single number in Ohio. "Shelby's number," Daniels confirmed. "He's been using Jamie's phone for the past year. The messages sent to friends and family, all him. He's been posing as Jamie." Harris leaned back, the revelation settling like a weight in his chest. "So he's been hiding in plain sight, but why? What's his endgame?" Reynolds crossed his arms, his expression grim. Maybe Jamie didn't run away. Maybe she never left Philadelphia. As the day unfolded, the pieces began to align. Surveillance footage from an Ohio gas station revealed a man resembling Shelby Neely, accompanied by a small child. The timestamp matched one of the transactions on Jamie's debit card. Harris's gut tightened. If Shelby had Jamie's phone and card, then where was she? That evening, Harris stood before the evidence board, the weight of the case pressing heavily on him. He circled Shelby's name with a red marker, drawing a thick line connecting it to the Ivanic family photo. The implications were chilling. Shelby wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a suspect. Reynolds entered the room, holding another report. "It gets worse," he said. "We found traces of bleach in the Ivanic basement, enough to suggest someone tried to clean up after the killings. And Harris, we found a small child's toy buried under some trash bags in the same room." Harris's heart sank. Jamie and Shelby had a young daughter. Was she in Ohio with him, or had she been caught in this horrifying web? As the detectives prepared a warrant to track Shelby's whereabouts, Harris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were already too late. The photo of Jamie smiling with her daughter hung at the center of the board, a stark reminder of what was at stake. Was Shelby capable of murdering his wife and in-laws? And if so, had he crossed the line no one wanted to consider? Reynolds placed a hand on Harris's shoulder. "We'll find him, and we'll get answers." Harris nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the board. Answers were coming, but he feared they'd only lead to darker truths. In a quiet neighborhood in Ohio, far removed from the chaos of Philadelphia, Shelby Neely blended in perfectly. To anyone observing from the outside, he appeared to be an ordinary single father, quietly raising his young daughter in a modest two-bedroom apartment. The residents in the building barely noticed him, and those who did saw nothing unusual. A man who kept to himself, polite but distant. Mrs. Crawford, his elderly neighbor, often watched him from her window. Shelby, as he introduced himself, was an enigma. He rarely exchanged more than pleasantries, but his daughter was a curious sight, always clinging to him, her wide eyes wary of strangers. "He's protective," Mrs. Crawford would later recall, "almost too much." Inside the apartment, however, the facade of normalcy unraveled. Shelby's small living room was sparse, cluttered only with boxes he had never unpacked. Jamie's phone lay on the kitchen counter, its screen dark. Shelby picked it up occasionally, scrolling through messages, replying in her voice, carefully maintaining the illusion that she was still alive. As he tapped out another text to one of Jamie's friends, his face remained impassive. "Doing well, just need some time away," he typed, hitting send without hesitation. It was a lie he had perfected over months. Shelby's relationship with Jamie had always been complicated. He often replayed their arguments in his mind, the sharp words, the escalating tension. He justified his actions to himself. "She was threatening the family, threatening our daughter." It was a mantra he clung to, but even in the quiet of his thoughts, doubts crept in. One evening, as Shelby sat at the dinner table across from his daughter, she finally spoke. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Shelby's fork froze midair. He forced a smile, though his chest tightened. "Mommy's away, sweetheart. She's taking some time for herself." The girl nodded, her gaze dropping to her plate. Shelby exhaled, relieved the conversation hadn't gone further, but her question lingered in his mind long after she had gone to bed. Meanwhile, the walls around Shelby were beginning to close in. His use of Jamie's debit card hadn't gone unnoticed, and a clerk at a nearby gas station remembered him distinctly. He was nervous, the clerk later told investigators, kept looking over his shoulder like he was afraid someone might see him. The fear wasn't unfounded. Shelby had taken great care to erase traces of his presence in Philadelphia, but loose threads remained. The Ivanic family home held secrets he couldn't completely bury, scuff marks on the floor, a faint smell of bleach, and most damning of all, his fingerprints on the murder weapon. Back in Ohio, Shelby's paranoia grew. He avoided eye contact with neighbors, avoided public places unless absolutely necessary. One night, he was startled awake by the sound of a police siren in the distance. For a moment, he thought they had found him. His breath quickened, his hands trembling as he reached for the phone. It wasn't them, not yet. But Shelby's greatest mistake was underestimating the power of human memory. Mrs. Crawford, observant as always, had overheard snippets of phone conversations through the thin apartment walls. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the name Jamie, spoken in anger. "He said her name often," Mrs. Crawford later recounted, "but it didn't sound loving. It sounded like a fight." The tension inside Shelby's apartment was palpable, even to outsiders. Each day, his grip on control slipped further, and the life he had so meticulously constructed began to crack. In Philadelphia, Detective Harris worked late into the night connecting the dots. Shelby's name now stood at the center of the evidence board, circled in red. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was a fugitive, a suspect in a case that was unraveling faster than Shelby could ever imagine, and he didn't even know they were coming for him. Detective Harris stared at the fresh evidence spread across his desk. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align, yet the picture they painted was darker than he had imagined. Jamie's phone activity in Ohio, Shelby's increasingly suspicious behavior, and now, a new witness. Every detail pointed to one conclusion. Shelby Neely wasn't just running, he was hiding something far worse. "Got something," Reynolds said, stepping into the room with a file in hand. "A clerk from that Ohio gas station just gave a statement, said Shelby's been acting jumpy, kept his head down the whole time, but the kid, she asked for her mom." Harris's jaw tightened. "She's asking for Jamie?" He leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "She doesn't know, does she?" Reynolds shook his head. "Doesn't seem like it. But Harris, what if Jamie never made it out of Philadelphia? What if Shelby—" His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the crime scene photos, the bleach traces in the basement, the scuff marks near the front door, and now the growing list of lies Shelby had spun to keep Jamie's friends and family at bay. "We need to bring him in before this gets any worse." Across state lines, Shelby sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of Jamie's phone casting shadows across his face. Another text buzzed in. "Where are you, Jamie? We're worried." He stared at it for a moment, debating his response. Finally, he typed back, "I'm fine, just need some time to figure things out. Please don't call." It was the same excuse he'd given a dozen times before, but it had always worked. People wanted to believe Jamie was okay. They didn't want to dig deeper. But deep down, Shelby knew the lies wouldn't hold forever. His daughter wandered into the room, clutching a worn stuffed animal. "Daddy, can we call Mommy now?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Shelby froze. "Not tonight, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Mommy's still busy." The little girl nodded, retreating to her room. As soon as she was out of sight, Shelby's expression hardened. He couldn't afford to slip. Not now, not when they might be closing in. At the precinct, Harris and Reynolds reviewed the latest findings. Bank records showed consistent purchases in Ohio, groceries, gas, and supplies for a child. Surveillance footage placed Shelby at multiple locations, always with his daughter but never Jamie. And then there was the neighbor, Mrs. Crawford, whose observations added another layer of suspicion. "She heard him talking about Jamie," Reynolds said, reading from the report. "Said it sounded more like an argument than anything else." Harris nodded slowly. "He's not just hiding, he's unraveling." A sudden knock on the door interrupted their discussion. It was Daniels from Forensics holding a plastic evidence bag. "We pulled this from the Ivanic basement," he said, handing it over. Inside was a single gold bracelet engraved with the initials J.I. Harris recognized it immediately. It was Jamie's. "Found it buried under a pile of cleaning supplies," Daniels added. "Whoever tried to cover this up didn't do a very good job." Harris held the bracelet in his hand, the weight of it symbolic of the truth they were closing in on. "We have enough," he said firmly. "Get the warrant. We're bringing him in." Meanwhile, in Ohio, Shelby felt the walls closing in. A siren wailed in the distance, sending a jolt of panic through him. He peeked through the blinds, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He had been careful, so careful. But now, every sound, every shadow, felt like the end. As his daughter slept peacefully in the next room, Shelby paced the living room, the weight of his lies finally bearing down on him. He reached for Jamie's phone again, scrolling through her messages, her photos. One image stopped him, a family picture taken months before everything fell apart. Jamie's smile was radiant, her arms wrapped protectively around their daughter. Shelby stared at it, his hand trembling. "I did this for her," he whispered to himself. "For our family." But even as he said the words, he knew they were hollow. The web of lies he had spun was unraveling faster than he could contain it, and deep down he knew there was no escaping the truth. The sun dipped low over the small Ohio town as Detective Harris and Reynolds pulled into the quiet apartment complex. The air buzzed with anticipation. Shelby Neely, the man they had been tracking for weeks, was inside. The arrest warrant sat on the dashboard, a simple piece of paper that carried the weight of justice. Harris adjusted his jacket and glanced at Reynolds. "Ready?" Reynolds nodded, his face grim. "Let's get him." They approached the building cautiously, flanked by local officers. The apartment complex was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from a distant television and the occasional chirp of crickets. Apartment 4B was at the far end of the corridor. Harris motioned for silence as they reached the door. Inside, Shelby sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he scrolled through Jamie's phone. A text from her sister blinked on the screen. "Jamie, please, just tell us you're okay." Shelby didn't reply. His lies were crumbling, and deep down, he knew it. His daughter played in the living room, her soft giggles piercing the silence. For a moment, Shelby allowed himself to feel the weight of it all, the deceit, the murders, the life he had tried to rebuild. But the knock at the door shattered his thoughts. Shelby froze. His eyes darted to the door, then to the hallway where his daughter was playing. The knock came again, louder this time. He stood slowly, his heart pounding. "Mr. Neely, this is the police. We need to speak with you." Harris stood firm, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. From inside, he heard muffled footsteps and the faint shuffle of movement. He exchanged a look with Reynolds. "He's stalling." "Open the door, Shelby," Reynolds barked, his voice echoing down the corridor. The sound of the deadbolt turning was followed by the door creaking open. Shelby stood there, his face pale but composed. His eyes darted between the officers. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. Harris stepped forward, holding up the warrant. "Shelby Neely, you're under arrest for the murders of Richard Ivanic, Laura Ivanic, and Nick Ivanic. Step outside now." For a moment, Shelby didn't move. His daughter peeked around the corner, clutching her stuffed animal. "Daddy?" she said softly, her eyes wide with confusion. Shelby glanced at her, his facade cracking. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "Daddy just needs to talk to these people." As he stepped forward, Reynolds moved to cuff him. Shelby didn't resist, but his shoulders slumped as the weight of the situation settled on him. The local officers moved in to escort the little girl, who began to cry softly, calling for her father. In the squad car, Harris sat across from Shelby in tense silence. The drive back to the station was long, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Finally, Harris broke the silence. "Why, Shelby? Why did it have to come to this?" Shelby didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, his jaw tight. "I didn't have a choice," he said finally, his voice low. "They were going to take her from me. I had to protect her." Harris shook his head, his frustration mounting. "Protect her? You tore apart her family. You stole everything from her." Shelby turned, his eyes cold. "You don't understand. They wouldn't have stopped until they had her. I did what I had to do." Harris didn't respond. He had heard enough excuses, enough justifications. The evidence would speak louder than any of Shelby's words. Back at the precinct, Shelby was led into an interrogation room, his hands still cuffed. Harris watched through the one-way mirror as Shelby sat down, his head in his hands. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in. Reynolds stepped up beside Harris. "We've got him, now we need the truth." Harris nodded. "And we won't stop until we have it all." As they prepared for the interrogation, the weight of the case settled heavily on their shoulders. Shelby's arrest was a step forward, but the path to justice was far from over. The interrogation room was stark and cold, its fluorescent light casting a harsh glow on the table where Shelby Neely sat. His hands, still cuffed, rested on the table as he stared at the blank wall ahead. Detective Harris entered the room, followed by Reynolds, who carried a file thick with evidence. They didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. Harris placed a photograph on the table, a family portrait of the Ivanics. "Richard, Laura, Nick, Jamie." His voice was calm but deliberate, each name a dagger aimed at Shelby's composure. "They're all gone, Shelby. And you're the reason why." Shelby's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from the photo. "I had no choice," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Reynolds leaned forward, his tone sharp. "No choice? You killed them, Shelby. You destroyed an entire family. Don't tell us you didn't have a choice." Shelby's eyes flicked toward Reynolds, anger flashing for a brief moment before he sighed heavily. "You don't understand. They were going to take her from me. Jamie. She threatened me. She said I'd never see my daughter again." "Jamie threatened you?" Harris's voice was skeptical, probing. He slid another photograph across the table, Jamie's bracelet found in the basement. "This was hers. You left it there, Shelby, just like you left her." Shelby's facade cracked. He buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking as he began to speak. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It got out of control." "Then tell us what happened," Harris pressed. "Start from the beginning." Shelby took a shaky breath, his voice trembling as he recounted the events. "Jamie and I fought that night. She She was holding a knife. She said she'd hurt herself if I didn't let her take our daughter and leave. I tried to stop her. I grabbed the knife and she fell. It wasn't supposed to happen." "Jamie fell?" Reynolds interjected, disbelief etched in his tone. "That's your story?" Shelby's gaze hardened. "It's the truth," he snapped. "But then I panicked. Her parents, they'd never believe me. They'd take my daughter away, so I went to their house." His voice grew quieter, almost detached. "Richard and Laura were asleep. I used a hammer. It was quick." He paused, his breath shallow. "Nick, he came home later. I didn't want to do it, but he would have known. I spent the evening with him like nothing was wrong. Then when he fell asleep," Shelby's voice faltered and he looked away. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. "And the dogs?" he asked, his voice low. "They barked," Shelby admitted. "I couldn't let them draw attention. I had to clean everything up." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Shelby's words settling over them. Harris leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet rage. "You call that cleaning up? You call murdering an entire family and pretending to be your wife cleaning up?" Shelby didn't respond. He simply stared at the table, his shoulders slumped. "You didn't just kill them," Reynolds said, his tone cutting. "You erased them. You pretended to be Jamie, lied to everyone who cared about her. And for what? So you could keep running." Shelby finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "I did it for my daughter. Everything I did, it was for her." Harris stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "No, Shelby, you didn't do this for her. You did this for yourself." As the detectives left the room, Shelby remained seated, his confession echoing in the empty space around him. For the first time, he was truly alone, with no lies left to shield him. Detective Harris sat in the dimly lit evidence room, his fingers tracing the edges of a small flash drive recently recovered from Jamie Ivanic's belongings. It had been tucked away in a hidden compartment of her desk, overlooked during the initial investigation. The label was unassuming, marked only by Jamie's initials, yet something about it felt heavy, like it carried a piece of her that had been silenced too soon. "Ready?" Reynolds asked, standing by the laptop. Harris nodded, leaning forward as Reynolds plugged the flash drive in. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of audio files. Each was time-stamped, the earliest dating back several months before the murders. Harris inhaled deeply. "Play the first one." The room filled with Jamie's voice, soft but trembling. "It's happening again. Shelby's temper. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending everything's fine. He's different now. Darker." Harris exchanged a glance with Reynolds, both men silent as Jamie's fears poured through the speakers. The recordings continued, each one peeling back another layer of the life she had tried to hide. Arguments filled the space, Shelby's voice sharp and cutting, Jamie's filled with quiet desperation. "You think you can leave me?" Shelby's voice thundered in one recording, followed by the sound of glass shattering. "Go ahead, Jamie, but you'll never take her with you." Another file played, this one quieter. Jamie's tone was resolute but tinged with fear. "I have to leave. For my daughter. For me. I don't know how, but I'll find a way." Harris's fist clenched as he listened. Jamie had been trapped, her cries for help contained within these files, her voice, now a haunting echo, speaking from beyond the grave. The final recording was different. Jamie spoke in a hurried whisper, her words deliberate, as if she knew time was running out. "If something happens to me, it's Shelby. He's been watching me, following me everywhere. Please, please don't let him take her. Protect my daughter." Reynolds paused the playback, his jaw tight. She knew. She knew he was capable of this. Harris didn't respond immediately. He sat back, the weight of Jamie's words pressing down on him. "She tried to fight back," he said finally. "She left breadcrumbs, hoping someone would find them." "And we did," Reynolds said, "but it's too late for her." "Not for her daughter," Harris countered, his voice firm. "We still have a chance to give her something Jamie never had. Freedom." Hours later, Harris stood before the evidence board, Jamie's photo at the center. Her voice had transformed the case, painting Shelby not as a man pushed to the edge, but as a manipulator, someone who had meticulously planned each step to ensure his control remained absolute. In the interrogation room, Shelby sat motionless, his expression blank as Harris entered with the laptop. Without a word, Harris hit play on the final recording. Jamie's voice filled the room, accusing him with every syllable. "If something happens to me, it's Shelby." Shelby's head snapped up, his composure faltering. "Where did you get that?" "She left it for us," Harris said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "She wanted us to know the truth." Shelby's fists clenched, his breathing uneven. She was lying, he spat. She wanted to destroy me. I was protecting my family. No, Harris said sharply. You weren't protecting anyone but yourself. Jamie tried to escape you, and you made sure she couldn't. Shelby's silence was deafening. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his web of lies was unraveling completely. As the audio finished, Harris stood, his gaze piercing. Jamie's gone, Shelby, but her voice, it's still here, and it's going to make sure you pay for what you did. Shelby's shoulders sagged, the weight of his crimes finally crashing down on him. Harris stepped out of the room, leaving Shelby alone, haunted not by the detectives, but by Jamie's voice, which refused to be silenced. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the trial of Shelby Neely began. Reporters lined the back row, their cameras trained on the defendant who sat expressionless, flanked by his legal team. Shelby's demeanor betrayed no emotion, but his stillness carried a weight that filled the room. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Rachel Moore arranged her files with precision, her focus unshakable. Detective Harris observed from the gallery, his jaw set as the clerk called the court to order. The Ivanic family's surviving relatives were seated nearby, their faces etched with grief and determination. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. The opening statement by the prosecution cut through the room like a blade. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a case of a man pushed to his limits. This is a case of control, manipulation, and cold-blooded murder. Shelby Neely meticulously planned and executed the deaths of Richard, Laura, and Nick Ivanic, as well as his own wife, Jamie. And for what? To maintain a grip on his daughter and his narrative. Each word landed heavily, painting a damning picture of Shelby as a man who valued his lies more than lives. The jury, 12 men and women carefully selected for their impartiality, leaned forward, their attention fixed. The prosecution's first witness was Carla Mason, Jamie's closest friend. Taking the stand, Carla's voice trembled but held firm as she recounted Jamie's fear in the months leading up to her death. She told me she was afraid of him, Carla said, her eyes glistening. She said Shelby was watching her, controlling her every move. She wanted to leave, but she didn't know how. The jury's gaze shifted to Shelby, whose face remained impassive, yet in that moment, the weight of Carla's words seemed to fill the room. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution played Jamie's final recording. Her voice, filled with quiet resolve, echoed through the courtroom. If something happens to me, it's Shelby. The jury's collective intake of breath was audible, and even the reporters' pens paused mid-scribble. Shelby stared at the table, his hands folded tightly together. The defense attempted to paint a different picture. Shelby's attorney argued that he had acted out of fear, claiming Jamie had been unstable and posed a danger to herself and their daughter. But the evidence was unrelenting. The murder weapon, the staged text messages, and Shelby's own confession dismantled any attempt at sympathy. Harris took the stand on the fourth day of the trial, his testimony methodical and unflinching. He recounted the investigation in vivid detail, from the grisly discovery of the bodies to the web of lies Shelby spun to evade capture. This wasn't a crime of passion, Harris concluded. This was calculated, premeditated. He knew exactly what he was doing. In her closing argument, Moore stood before the jury, her voice steady but impassioned. Jamie Ivanic's voice reached us from beyond the grave. It's up to you to make sure she's heard. Shelby Neely robbed an entire family of their future. Today, we ask you to ensure he doesn't escape the truth. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was clear and resolute. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. Shelby's expression didn't change as the verdict was read, but in the gallery, quiet sobs of relief broke out among the Ivanic family's loved ones. Justice had been served, though the cost was immeasurable. Harris stepped out of the courtroom into the crisp afternoon air, his shoulders heavy but his heart lighter. The Ivanic story wasn't over, it never would be, but today their voices had been heard. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the crowd of reporters and spectators long gone. Shelby Neely had been escorted out, his fate sealed by the jury's verdict. Guilty on all counts. Yet, as Detective Harris sat in the quiet gallery staring at the empty defendant's chair, he couldn't shake the lingering question, was justice truly served? The Ivanic family was gone, their voices silenced by Shelby's calculated violence. Jamie's recordings had brought clarity, but they couldn't bring her back. Her daughter, now living with extended relatives, would grow up knowing only fragments of her mother's life, pieces left behind in photos, memories, and court transcripts. District Attorney Rachel Moore joined Harris, a stack of papers in her arms. "You look like a man with unfinished business," she said, her voice low. Harris glanced at her, then back at the chair. "We got the verdict, but it doesn't feel like enough. Shelby took everything from that family. 30 years in prison. That's not justice." Moore set the papers down, folding her arms as she considered his words. "Justice is rarely perfect, Harris. But the system worked. Shelby will never walk free again. He'll never manipulate or hurt anyone else." Harris nodded slowly, though the weight in his chest remained. "I just keep thinking about Jamie, how she fought to leave breadcrumbs to make sure we'd know the truth. And now, she's just gone." Later that evening, Harris returned to his desk at the precinct. The evidence board had been taken down, the photos and files archived, but Jamie's photo remained. He hadn't been able to bring himself to take it down. Her smile, once so full of life, now felt like a reminder of everything he couldn't save. Reynolds entered, a cup of coffee in hand. "You're still here?" Harris gestured toward the photo. "She left her daughter a voice, but what do we leave her?" Reynolds sighed, sitting across from him. "We leave her a story where the bad guy doesn't win, where her mom's voice mattered. That's more than most people get." Harris nodded, his hand brushing against the corner of Jamie's picture. "I hope it's enough." Meanwhile, in a maximum security facility, Shelby sat alone in his cell. The walls were gray, the silence heavy. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the trial over and over. Jamie's voice haunted him, her words cutting through his attempts to justify his actions. "If something happens to me, it's Shelby." He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. In this place, there was no escape from her, no web of lies to hide behind. The truth was a weight he couldn't outrun. The Ivanic home remained empty, its windows boarded, the yard overgrown. Neighbors avoided it, the memories of what had happened there too heavy to face. But in one of the upstairs rooms, sunlight filtered through a crack in the boards, illuminating a small, forgotten detail, a handwritten note Jamie had once taped to her mirror. It read simply, "For her, I'll fight." Jamie had fought, in the only way she could, leaving her voice and her strength behind for her daughter. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was a beginning, a chance for her daughter to grow up free from Shelby's shadow. Harris stood outside the house one last time, his hands in his pockets. "She deserved better," he muttered, his voice carrying on the breeze. But as he turned to leave, he realized something. Jamie's fight wasn't over. Her story would continue, not through the courtroom or the headlines, but through the people who refused to let her voice fade. Justice was never perfect, but for Jamie, it would have to be enough. The Ivanic house stood silent, its boarded windows and overgrown yard a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Once a place of warmth and family, it was now a ghostly presence in the neighborhood. Few dared to pass by, and those who did spoke in hushed tones, their eyes casting quick glances toward the darkened windows. The house held secrets, memories that refused to fade. For Jamie's daughter, life had become a patchwork of new routines and unfamiliar faces. She now lived with Richard and Laura's distant relatives, a family she barely knew, but who loved her fiercely. They surrounded her with photos of Jamie, telling stories about her bravery, her kindness, and the love she carried for her daughter. Yet even with these efforts, the little girl often stared out the window, clutching her stuffed animal, asking the same question, "Why isn't Mommy coming back?" Detective Harris sat at his desk, staring at a thin envelope addressed to him. Inside was a handwritten note from Jamie's sister, thanking him for his dedication to the case. "Because of you, Jamie's voice was heard," it read. Harris folded the note carefully, placing it in his desk drawer alongside Jamie's photo. Reynolds entered the room, coffee in hand. "You still thinking about the case?" he asked, though the answer was clear. "Always," Harris replied. "But it's more than that. I'm thinking about her daughter, about what happens next." Reynolds leaned against the desk. "She's got a family who loves her. That's more than most get after something like this." Harris nodded but didn't respond. His mind drifted back to Jamie's recordings, her voice trembling yet determined. She had left her legacy not in wealth or possessions, but in truth. A truth that had ensured Shelby could never hurt anyone again. In prison, Shelby Neely adjusted to his new reality. The walls of his cell were bare, the days long and monotonous. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Jamie's face, heard her voice from the recordings played in court. The words echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder of the life he had destroyed. If something happens to me, it's Shelby. He tried to drown out the memories, convincing himself he had done what he needed to do. But the silence of the prison was unyielding, a constant companion that refused to let him forget. The community struggled to heal. Neighbors who had once shared friendly waves with the Ivanics now avoided the subject entirely. The local church held a candlelight vigil in their honor, a solemn event where members of the community gathered to mourn and reflect. Pastor Green spoke gently, his voice carrying over the flickering flames. We must remember not just their tragedy but their lives, the joy they brought, the love they shared. Among the attendees was Carla Mason, Jamie's best friend. She stood at the back holding a single flower. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered a silent apology. I should have done more, she murmured to herself. But deep down, she knew Jamie had done everything she could to protect her daughter, even at the cost of her own life. Months later, the Ivanic house was sold to a new family. They painted the walls, cleared the yard, and brought laughter back into its rooms. Yet, the neighbors couldn't help but wonder if the house remembered. Could walls hold memories? Could a home carry the weight of the past? They would never know for sure, but the whispers of tragedy lingered, as persistent as the wind. Harris drove by the house one last time, his thoughts heavy. Jamie's story was over, but her daughter's was just beginning. He hoped the girl would find peace, that the scars of her past wouldn't define her future. As he pulled away, Harris whispered a silent promise. We won't forget you, Jamie. The courtroom was silent now, the trial long over, but the echoes of the case remained. For those who had lived through it, the story of Shelby Neely and the Ivanic family had become more than just headlines. It was a painful reminder of the fragility of trust, the depths of human deception, and the resilience required to rebuild after devastation. Jamie's daughter sat on the floor of her new home, crayons scattered around her, as she carefully colored in a picture of a bright, sunny day. Her new guardians, Richard and Laura's extended family, watched her from the doorway. They spoke quietly, their voices filled with hope and determination. She'll know who her mother was, one said. Not what happened to her, but who she was. Brave, kind, loving. Detective Harris walked along the waterfront, his thoughts consumed by the case. The Ivanics were gone, their lives cut short by a man who had claimed to love them. Yet amidst the tragedy, Harris couldn't help but think of Jamie's final recordings, her courage in leaving a trail of truth for those who would follow. Her voice had ensured that justice, while imperfect, had been served. He stopped at a bench and pulled out a small notebook. Inside, he had written a single line from Jamie's last recording. If something happens to me, it's Shelby. He stared at the words, letting their weight settle over him. Her voice made the difference, Harris murmured, and it will keep making a difference. In the months following the trial, the community rallied to honor the Ivanics. The local church organized a memorial fund in their name, aimed at supporting families affected by domestic violence. Carla Mason, Jamie's best friend, became one of the fund's most outspoken advocates. At the fund's inaugural event, she stood before a crowd, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Jamie was more than a victim, Carla said. She was a mother, a sister, a friend. She tried to protect her daughter the best way she knew how, and though we couldn't save her, we can honor her by ensuring no one else feels as trapped and powerless as she did. The applause that followed was deafening, a collective promise to never forget Jamie's story. Meanwhile, Shelby Neely sat in his prison cell, the walls closing in around him. The weight of his actions pressed down like a storm he couldn't escape. Each day brought the same routine, the same emptiness. But worse than the monotony were the memories, Jamie's voice, her defiance, and the realization that she had outmaneuvered him even in death. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by her strength, unable to escape the truth he had tried so hard to suppress. For Jamie's daughter, the years ahead would be filled with questions. She would grow up surrounded by love, but also by the absence of the family she had lost. One day, she would learn the truth about what happened. She would hear her mother's voice through those recordings, understand the bravery it took to leave them behind, and carry forward the legacy of resilience her mother had left her. Detective Harris stood at Jamie's grave, a single white rose in his hand. He placed it gently on the headstone, the words etched into the marble stark against the sunlight. Jamie Ivanic, beloved mother, forever brave. You made sure we found the truth, he said quietly, and we won't let anyone forget it. As he turned to leave, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Jamie's story wasn't just about loss. It was about fighting for something greater, even in the face of impossible odds. Her voice had been silenced too soon, but its echoes would carry on, a testament to the strength of a woman who refused to be erased. What do you think of Shelby Neely and his chilling actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.